It was a chilly autumn evening in 1957 when Elvis Presley's pink Cadillac pulled up to the Southside Diner on the outskirts of Memphis, Tennessee. The neon sign flickered in the growing darkness, casting an eerie glow across the parking lot where a small group of teenagers immediately recognized the iconic car and began to whisper excitedly. Elvis had just finished a grueling 12-hour recording session at Sun Records, and the hunger gnawing at his stomach had overcome his usual caution about dining in public. As he stepped out of his car in his signature style, black pants, a simple white button-up shirt with the collar turned up, and his hair perfectly coiffed despite the long day, he had no idea that the next 15 minutes would not only change the lives of everyone at that small roadside diner, but reveal a side of Elvis Presley that the flashing cameras of fame never captured. What happened next would never make the newspapers or the celebrity magazines, but it would spread through whispered conversations across Tennessee until it became the stuff of local legend. The young hostess at the diner's entrance nearly dropped her menus when she recognized Elvis walking through the door. At just 22 years old, he was already a national sensation, having scandalized parents and delighted teenagers across America with his provocative hip movements and electrifying performances. But the look on her face wasn't just excitement. There was fear there too, a hint of what was about to unfold. Her eyes darted nervously toward the back office, and Elvis, attuned to people's reactions after years in the spotlight, sensed immediately that something was wrong. He was right, but he could never have predicted what was about to happen, or how his response would leave witnesses speechless. The hostess had barely stammered out a greeting when the manager appeared, a stern-faced man named Harold Wilson who had been running the Southside Diner for nearly 20 years. The silence that fell over the diner as he approached Elvis seemed to stretch out endlessly. The customers, mostly local families and truck drivers stopping for coffee, turned to stare. Something in Wilson's expression made it clear that this wasn't going to be the typical star-struck encounter that Elvis had grown accustomed to. But what the manager said next would set in motion a chain of events that would reveal exactly who Elvis Presley really was when the cameras weren't rolling and no one was watching, except this time, everyone was watching. "We don't serve your kind here," Wilson said loudly, his voice carrying across the now silent diner. The words hung in the air like a physical thing. Elvis stood frozen, momentarily confused. This kind of reception wasn't entirely new to him. His music and performance style had been controversial from the start, but an outright refusal of service was unexpected, especially in his home state. "Your kind?" Elvis repeated, genuinely puzzled. "What do you mean, sir?" Wilson's face reddened as he glanced at the growing crowd of teenagers peering through the windows outside. "Rock and roll hooligans," he clarified, spitting out the words like they tasted bad. "You're corrupting the youth of America with your music and your movements." He gestured vaguely toward Elvis's hips. "I've got decent families eating here. I don't need them disturbed by you or the commotion you bring." The teenagers outside pressed their faces against the glass, pointing and waving excitedly, inadvertently proving the manager's point about the commotion that followed Elvis everywhere. The diner fell completely silent as everyone waited to see how the young star would react. Would he get angry? Make a scene? Use his celebrity to demand service? Elvis Presley was known for his dynamic stage presence and passionate performances, but few knew what he was really like when faced with personal rejection. For the teenagers watching through the windows, this was like seeing their idol in a real-life drama more compelling than any performance. For the families inside, many of whom likely shared the manager's disapproval of rock and roll's influence, it was a moment of tension and uncertainty, but no one, not the adoring fans, not the disapproving adults, not even the self-righteous manager, could have predicted what Elvis did next. Elvis could have easily walked out. He could have pointed out that just 6 months earlier, this same manager had approached him for an autograph when he'd been dining with his mother at another restaurant across town, a fact that Sarah Mitchell, a young waitress working that night, would later record in her journal. He could have reminded everyone present that despite the controversy surrounding his performances, he was still a local boy who'd grown up poor in Tupelo, Mississippi before moving to Memphis. But he did none of those things. Instead, what Elvis did left a lasting impression on everyone who witnessed it, a response so unexpected that it would be recounted for decades in Memphis living rooms. "I understand, sir," Elvis said quietly, his voice carrying in the silent diner. "You've got a business to run, and that's your right." The lack of anger or indignation in his voice caught everyone off guard, including Wilson, who had clearly been preparing for an argument. For a moment it seemed like Elvis would simply leave, a surprising display of humility from someone who could have easily made a scene. But then, Just as the tension began to dissipate, Elvis glanced around the diner and noticed something that changed the entire situation. Something that would turn this moment of rejection into one of the most revealing episodes of his character ever documented. In the corner booth sat an elderly black man in worn overalls, eating alone while several empty tables surrounded him. It was 1957 in Tennessee, and despite growing civil rights advocacy, segregation was still the norm in many establishments. The Southside Diner wasn't officially segregated, but the unwritten rules were clear from the isolated placement of the elderly customer. Elvis's gaze lingered on the man for a moment, and then something shifted in his expression. What he did next would stun everyone present and demonstrate why Elvis Presley, despite his controversial image, commanded deep respect from people who actually knew him beyond the headlines. Elvis nodded politely to Wilson and said, "Thank you for your time." The tension in the room began to dissipate as it appeared he was going to leave without incident. But instead of walking out the door, Elvis walked directly to the corner booth where the elderly man sat alone. "Excuse me, sir," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Would you mind if I joined you? I've been recording all day, and I'm mighty hungry, but it seems they don't have a table for me here." The entire diner seemed to collectively hold its breath. Even the teenagers outside fell silent, pressing closer to the windows to witness what was happening. This wasn't just a celebrity encounter anymore. It was something far more significant, and everyone present somehow sensed it. The elderly man looked up in shock, clearly recognizing Elvis immediately. "You want to sit with me?" he asked incredulously. Elvis nodded, smiling warmly. "If you don't mind the company," he responded. The man gestured to the empty seat across from him, seemingly too stunned to speak further. Elvis slid into the booth as a murmur ran through the diner. The manager, Wilson, stood rooted to the spot, his face flushing deeper red. The scene was set for what would happen next, a moment that would change not just the atmosphere in the diner, but potentially the perspectives of everyone witnessing it. "Sir," Wilson said, approaching the table nervously, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. Of course we can serve you. We have plenty of empty tables over here." He gestured to the main section of the diner. Elvis looked up at him with a steady gaze that stopped Wilson mid-gesture. What Elvis said next would be quoted by Sarah Mitchell, the young waitress who witnessed the entire exchange, in her journal that night. "I think I'm right where I ought to be, sir. Unless you're saying this gentleman doesn't deserve to eat in the main section either." Wilson stammered, clearly caught in his own hypocrisy, as Elvis continued calmly. "Now I'd love a cheeseburger, fries and a chocolate shake, and whatever my friend here would like for dessert." He turned to the elderly man with genuine warmth. "Please let me buy you dessert, sir, to thank you for sharing your table." The elderly man, who introduced himself as Joseph Taylor, appeared overcome with emotion but managed to order a slice of apple pie. The other diners watched in stunned silence. This wasn't how they expected the situation to unfold, but the most extraordinary part of the evening was just beginning. As Elvis and Mr. Taylor ate together, their initial awkward silence gradually melted into conversation. Elvis asked questions and listened intently to the answers, showing none of the self-absorption often associated with celebrities. The other diners couldn't help but eavesdrop as they learned that Joseph Taylor had worked for the railroad for 42 years before retiring. He had 5 grandchildren and 2 great-grandchildren. He had served in World War I, but it was what they discovered next that transformed the evening from a simple act of defiance against segregation into something even more powerful, a genuine connection across generations and races through the universal language of music. "So what kind of work did you do for the railroad, Mr. Taylor?" Elvis asked, genuinely interested. Taylor explained he had primarily worked as a porter, but had also helped with mechanical issues when needed. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "But on weekends, back in my younger days, I used to play guitar in juke joints all across the Delta." Elvis's face lit up at this revelation, his eyes widening with excitement. "No kidding?" He leaned forward eagerly. "Mr. Taylor, the blues is at the heart of everything I do. Who did you listen to back then? Who did you play with?" What followed was a conversation that captivated everyone within earshot. Joseph Taylor described seeing legendary bluesmen perform in tiny venues across the Mississippi Delta in the 1920s, some of whom had never been recorded or documented in music history. He talked about techniques and styles that had been passed down through generations of musicians who couldn't read or write music but carried complex traditions in their hands and voices. And Elvis Presley, the biggest star in American music at that moment, pulled a napkin toward him and began taking notes like a student before a master. But what happened next would elevate the evening from merely surprising to truly unforgettable. "You know," Taylor said at one point, looking at Elvis with a twinkle in his eye, "my grandkids think I'm making it up when I tell them about the places I played. Nobody believes an old man like me was ever a musician." Elvis looked thoughtful for a moment, and then did something that Sarah Mitchell in her journal entry described as the most genuine act of kindness I've ever witnessed. This spontaneous gesture would impact not only Joseph Taylor but eventually his entire family and community in ways that no one could have predicted when the evening began. "Mr. Taylor," Elvis said, "would you play something for us? Right now?" Taylor laughed nervously. "I haven't held a guitar in 15 years, son. My hands aren't what they used to be." But Elvis was already standing up. "One moment," he said, and walked out to his pink Cadillac. Through the windows, the diners watched as he opened the trunk and pulled out a guitar case. The whispers in the diner reached a fever pitch as Elvis returned and carefully placed the case on the table. Even the most disapproving adults in the room couldn't help but be drawn into the unfolding scene. This wasn't the Elvis Presley they thought they knew from television and controversial headlines. "This is a 1942 Martin D18, Elvis said, opening the case to reveal a beautiful acoustic guitar. "It's my practice guitar. Goes with me everywhere." He held it out to Taylor. "Would you honor us, sir?" The elderly man's hands trembled slightly as he took the instrument. "I don't know about this," he said quietly. But Elvis just smiled encouragingly. "Music doesn't forget you, Mr. Taylor, even if it's been a while." The diner had fallen completely silent again, but this time it was a silence of anticipation rather than tension. Joseph Taylor's weathered fingers found the strings, and after a few tentative strums began to play. The hesitancy in his hands melted away as muscle memory took over, and soon the diner was filled with the soulful sound of Delta blues played by a man who had lived it. The raw authenticity of his playing silenced even the most skeptical onlookers. This wasn't the polished commercial music they were used to hearing on the radio. This was something primal and real, music born from struggle and joy and the deepest human experiences. Elvis sat back in the booth, his face shining with genuine admiration. Several customers put down their forks and closed their eyes, transported by Taylor's playing. When Taylor finished the song, there was a moment of reverent silence before the diner erupted in spontaneous applause. The elderly man looked around in shock, as if he had forgotten where he was and who was watching. There were tears in his eyes as he carefully handed the guitar back to Elvis. "You've still got it, Mr. Taylor," Elvis said with deep respect in his voice. "That's the real thing right there. That's where it all comes from." The evening could have ended there, a beautiful moment of connection across generations and racial lines, but Elvis had one more surprise that would truly demonstrate the depth of his character and have consequences that would extend far beyond that single evening in a Memphis diner. As he was paying the bill for both his meal and Taylor's, Elvis took out a small notebook and pen. "Mr. Taylor," he said, "my producer at Sun Records, Sam Phillips, is always looking for authentic musicians who understand the roots of this music. Would you mind if I took down your telephone number? I can't promise anything, but I'd like him to hear you play." Joseph Taylor gave his information, clearly not expecting anything to come of it. The other diners watched this exchange with curiosity. Was this just a kind gesture to make an old man feel good? Or was Elvis Presley genuinely impressed by what he'd heard? The answer would come 2 weeks later in a way that would change Joseph Taylor's life forever. 2 weeks after the diner incident, Joseph Taylor received an unexpected call from Sun Records inviting him to a recording session. Over the next year, Taylor would record a collection of blues standards and original compositions that preserved his unique style and experience for posterity. Though the recordings were never commercial hits, they became valued historical documents of the Delta blues tradition and provided Taylor with supplemental income and recognition in his final years. More importantly, they gave him the opportunity to share his musical legacy with his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, who never doubted his stories again, all because Elvis Presley had been denied service at a diner and chosen to respond not with anger or entitlement, but with a simple act of respect that rippled outward in ways he couldn't have imagined. The impact of that evening extended beyond Joseph Taylor. Sarah Mitchell, the waitress who documented the encounter in her journal, noted that manager Harold Wilson was profoundly affected by witnessing Elvis's actions. "Mr. Wilson wasn't the same after that night," she wrote. "It was like watching someone have their eyes opened for the first time." Within a month, Wilson had removed the unspoken seating policies at the Southside Diner. 6 months later, he hired his first black server. Small changes, perhaps, in the larger context of the civil rights movement, but significant ripples from one evening's unexpected encounter that demonstrated how a single act of principled kindness could transform perspectives and challenge long-held prejudices. As for Elvis himself, the story never appeared in any newspapers or official biographies during his lifetime. Unlike carefully crafted publicity stunts, this was a genuine moment of character witnessed only by those present. But the story spread through Memphis by word of mouth, becoming part of the local understanding of who Elvis Presley really was behind the controversial public image. Years later, when Joseph Taylor passed away in 1966, Elvis sent a large flower arrangement to the funeral with a simple note, "Thank you for the music and the lesson, Elvis Presley." This small gesture, unknown to the public or press, speaks volumes about the authentic relationship that began that night in the diner and the lasting impact it had on Elvis himself. The full story might have remained just local legend had it not been for Sarah Mitchell's journal, which was discovered by her granddaughter after Mitchell's death in 2009. The detailed account, written the very night of the encounter, provided such a vivid picture of the evening that it eventually caught the attention of serious Elvis biographers looking to understand the man behind the mythology. When the account was finally published in a 2015 collection of previously unknown Elvis stories, it offered a window into a side of Elvis that his fans had always sensed but that had rarely been documented so clearly. His genuine respect for the black musicians who had influenced him and his quiet but firm stance against the segregation norms of his time. Music historians have since pointed to this incident as evidence of Elvis's complex relationship with race and music during a deeply divided era. While some critics had accused Elvis of simply appropriating black music for profit, stories like the Southside Diner encounter paint a more nuanced picture of a young man who genuinely respected the origins of the music he loved and used his growing influence to challenge racial boundaries in small but meaningful ways. What makes this story particularly significant is that it wasn't performed for cameras or publicity. It was simply Elvis Presley being himself when confronted with a moment that revealed his true character. The evening at the Southside Diner stands as a testament to the fact that true character is revealed not in the spotlight, but in unexpected moments when no one thinks the cameras are rolling. Elvis could have simply left when denied service, avoiding confrontation. He could have used his celebrity to demand special treatment. Instead, he chose a third path, one that acknowledged the dignity of a fellow musician whose society had pushed to the margins, and in doing so revealed the depth of his own humanity. Perhaps that's why this story continues to resonate decades after his death. It captures not the carefully constructed image of a rock and roll star, but the authentic heart of a young man whose respect for music and its origins transcended the racial and social boundaries of his time. For Sarah Mitchell, who watched it all unfold from behind her serving tray, the impact was immediately clear. The final lines of her journal entry that night read, "I've heard people talk about Elvis like he's just a troublemaker with his wild music and dancing. After tonight, I know better. I saw a man stand up for what's right without raising his voice or making a scene. He just quietly showed everyone what decency looks like. And somehow that was more powerful than any shouting could ever be."